just said, I hear this tension between scale and context, which, admittedly, coming out of SFI, this was the thing. This was the reason that organization refused to allow itself to be pigeonholed as a think tank, because it didn't want to be seen as advising on policy, because to advise on policy would be to suggest that there is a right way to do things, when all of the work coming out of this organization suggested contextuality and situatedness. And
again,
even the people who work on scaling laws said, this is a curve, the most interesting feature of which is the fact that beings fall off the curve to one side or the other. It's the fact that the closer you look at this curve, the more you notice deviations, and that those deviations are what Gregory Bateson said, is the difference that makes a difference. That's information about the substructure of that scaling law, about the interactions that you're talking about. And so one of the 6 fields within which I think about this show operating is regulation and cognition across scales. And how, to me, the real problem that we're seeing with technology, in spite of what you just said, it's like, or maybe in accordance with it, the problem is the scalability, the applicability of the hammer to every possible nail, rather than there being a hammer that's right for this particular nail.
Right.
And that what we're losing in this process is context. And so if you say that the transcendental is a domain in which function is being, then what I want to ask you is, the counter to that is the immanental, right? And so in that space, what is different, and how can we think about this in a way that might allow us to work with technology that is, it's not just completely subservient to the objective, but to plural objectives.
Right. Okay. One thing, transcendental versus imaginal. To me, imaginal just means what we usually mean by imaginary, but with the added caveat or detail that it is an objective reality. It's not just simply the unreal. There's a dimension of reality which Henri Corbin called the imaginal. The Sufi mystics go there. All the mystics go there. All the poets go there. There is, at the bottom of our world, an open abyss of images in which all the possibilities inhere. One can choose to listen to what I say and see it as metaphor or not. It doesn't matter. This is the world where metaphors are real. And it's to that world that I think technology belongs by nature. If you were to find it, as my friend Jeffrey Wadham once put it, if you found a teapot on Mars, okay, so let's say you're an alien explorer, you land on Mars, or not a human, because you would know what a human would know what a teapot is. If you found a teapot on Mars, you would immediately, if you had a brain to think, perceive that it contrasts ontologically with its environment by virtue of its careful calibration for a purpose. And so you would know that whoever is responsible for the existence of this object has access to the imaginal, because whoever created this object can think in terms of purposeful embodiment or incarnation. And so that's what I meant. So it's not the transcendental or the transcendent, but rather the imaginal. So how is that different from material reality? Material reality is causal. The imaginal is not causal. That's why synchronicity is a form of relation that obtains or originates from the imaginal world. Synchronicities are non-causal connections between things that generate meaning precisely because they're not causal. If you happen to think of your friend whose nickname is Finch, and then suddenly a finch flies through the room, through your window, if you find out later that Finch was out in the tree with a finch waiting for you to think of him before he threw the bird in, there was no synchronicity. It's only a synchronicity if there's a non-causal connection. So in the imagination, this is something that Hume saw. David Hume, the great philosopher, he saw that when we imagine the world as it could be, or when we imagine possible worlds, we immediately experience the contingency of any causal laws in such a world. You don't need causal connections in a world. Our material world has causal laws, and these causal laws scale infinitely down, right? This is Leibniz, another classical philosopher, who said that the difference between our machines, our man-made machines, and the machines of nature is that the machines of nature are machines in all of their parts infinitely. So it's not so much that there's some kind of ontological divide between the imaginal world, where we draw our ideas from machines, and this material world, but rather that this material world is an infinite machine, which means it's jagged, which means it's rough, which means that if you look at anything closely enough, you'll see how it's different from what you thought it was and how it's different from every other instance of what you're looking at. Which is why the difference that makes a difference is not simply a way of approaching reality, but the very fundamental principle of reality. This is Gilles Deleuze's great book, Difference in Repetition. It's all about how we've always conceived of the world as adhering primarily at the deepest level in identity. A equals A. Deleuze says, no, the world is fundamentally difference. The deepest ontological force is the force of difference itself. And so nothing can be cataloged. Every model that attempts to allow us to apprehend the world intellectually is inadequate to the world in its fullness, because the world in its fullness is pure difference.